Jeremy Scahill, you've written this piece on alternate.org that just got published. This has changed. 20 hawks, Clintonites, and Neocons to watch for in Obama's White House. Right.
I mean, David is talking about the transitional team that Obama's pulled together that's working now under John Podesta, Bill Clinton's former chief of staff. And what I've looked at in depth is the foreign policy team that surrounds Barack Obama. These are people that are on the transition team or are foreign policy advisors or already have been named to the cabinet or very well may get cabinet positions. One of the things I think is important to point out here, people have made the point that the Obama house is flush with Clintonites. You know, all of these people that we knew in the 1990s, some people who were senior advisors to Hillary Clinton jumped onto the Obama bandwagon after Hillary conceded defeat. But what's important to remember is what 1990s foreign policy looked like, because while Barack Obama campaigned on a pledge to bring change, if you actually analyze U.S. foreign policy from George H.W. Bush through Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, there are great consistencies. I mean, Bill Clinton's policies, his foreign policies in the 1990s, really laid the groundwork for much of what President Bush did when he was in office. You had the Iraq Liberation Act, which was passed in 1998, which was the result of a collusion between neoliberal Democrats, neoconservative Republicans. That made regime change in Iraq mandatory. Clinton mercilessly punished the people of Iraq through economic sanctions, the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam. They dismantled Yugoslavia, bombed it. They implemented policies such as the Rambouillet Accord against Milosevic. That was essentially a setup to take away Yugoslavia's sovereignty, very similar to what Bush did in the lead up to the Iraq invasion. Clinton hit Sudan, he hit Afghanistan. His free trade globalization policies devastated economies around the world and working people. And what I point out in my piece is that many of the architects of those policies in the 1990s were not only people who supported the Iraq war in the lead up and promoted the myth that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, but they are now at the center of the Obama foreign policy team. I mean, from the jump, you had Joe Biden. His selection as the vice presidential candidate was a clear indication that the old guard Democrats were going to be securely embedded in the Obama White House. You know, Biden is, I think, one of the experiences in Biden's life bears particular mention, and that is that Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the summer of 2002 when the Iraq war was being debated. Joe Biden was the man in charge of framing the so-called debate, and he refused to call two witnesses in particular who would have thoroughly debunked all of the lies that were being told. One is the former chief UN weapons inspector, Scott Ritter. The other is the former head of the UN program in Iraq, Hans von Spanik. Now, I was with von Spanik at that time, and we were pressing Biden's committee to call him to testify. The reason we wanted von Spanik there is because he had just come back from the north of Iraq and had observed Ansar al-Islam guerrillas, the so-called al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, and would have testified that, in fact, they were not being trained by Saddam's government, that they were receiving no assistance, that, in fact, they were fighting Saddam's government and were operating from the U.S.-enforced safe haven of northern Iraq, or Iraqi Kurdistan. Rahm Emanuel, a hardliner on Israel, of course, as we've talked about on this program before, also one of the key people in the passage of NAFTA, and someone who's called for a dramatic expansion of the U.S. military. Madeleine Albright, one of the deans of the Democratic policy elite. Whether she gets a post or not in the Obama administration, many of her proteges are some of the key people operating now in the Obama team. Richard Holbrooke, who, of course, was one of the point people in the genocide in East Timor under the Carter administration, who also was one of the key figures in dismantling of Yugoslavia and also promoted the myth that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and in fact praised Colin Powell's fraudulent testimony before the United Nations, saying it was masterful diplomacy. These are some of the key people there, including Tony Lake. Juan, you know him well, the former national security advisor, deeply responsible for the destruction of Haiti.
Jeremy, those are some of the bigger names, but you also named some others that are less well known. You mentioned too Ivo Daalder and Michelle Flournoy, both of whom were associated with the neoconservative Project for the New American Century.
Right. I mean, many of these people. I mean, you have at the top of the list, you have Dennis Ross, who was both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton's Middle East envoy, and Martin Indyk. Both of them worked very closely with AIPAC as well as the Project for a New American Century. Michelle Flournoy, who's one of the people that down the line may be tapped as the first female defense secretary, also working with the Project for a New American Century, and in fact authored a paper that is said to have reframed Obama's perspective on Iraq, backing him off of the total withdrawal rhetoric and looking more at a sort of residual force, downsized, rebranded occupation. One of the people that David mentioned, Sarah Sewell, who comes from the Carr Center at Harvard, in addition to the work that David talked about, we have to remember that Sarah Sewell is someone who has collaborated with General David Petraeus in rebranding American counterinsurgency doctrine. She wrote the introduction to the U.S. Army Field Manual's publication of the U.S. Army Counterinsurgency Manual. This is a manual that is based on deception, lies, shadow warfare, paramilitary warfare, and she's been criticized by progressives and other academics for collaborating with the military in developing how to make a better, more effective war machine that also can be spun in human rights circles as, well, softer than that of George W. Bush. I mean, really what we're talking about here is not just Bush light, but an extension of the sort of militaristic, belligerent foreign policy that has been a staple of the U.S. machine for all of our lifetimes.
David Corn, your response.